Good morning. I'm going to call this meeting of the Governance Committee to order. We will start with a roll call. Councilor Tabor.
I'm here.
And I'm Councilor Cook, and I'm here. Councilor Lombardi is away today. The first thing we would normally do in this meeting is review and approve the minutes of the meeting. I'm going to wait until Councilor Lombardi can return, if that's okay with you, Councilor Tabor.
Yes, we'd want to hear from him.
Thank you. So under old business, I said I would give a parks update this morning. I'm still working on that. I don't have a much of an update yet. So stay tuned. I will put this again on the agenda for our next meeting, and hopefully we'll have a more thorough update then. As far as the administrative ordinance committee language cleanup goes, anyone who's on Zoom or watching this later will know that we had been working on administrative ordinance changes for months as a committee. And then we hit a snag in the process because there were questions about ways that we could or could not change term stagger for specific committees, especially those that are governed by state law, by RSA. I think this impacts mostly our land use boards. So as a result, we've been kind of in a holding pattern, trying to decide how we would handle that. At the moment, the thinking that I'm receiving from our legal counsel, and anyone here can correct me if I'm wrong, is that we should go ahead and go back to, rather than changing the ordinance to reflect a request for stagger yet, we should go back to the committees that have these challenges that are not governed by RSA. So that would be committees like parking, traffic, and safety, and say, you have a challenge with your stagger. Do you want to address this in your own committee and see if you have any recommendations on how you want to fix it as a committee? And let them then come back to us if they want any additional change to the RSA, or if they want to address it directly with the city clerk's office and voluntarily change their own terms, or how their thinking is on that. And I will volunteer to gladly come to their committee meeting to share kind of the concerns that we had around stagger, if any of those committees want to go ahead and address it that way. But then that leaves us with some of the other changes we were making to the administrative ordinance around just cleaning up language. This is a challenge. So I am giving this update today to let everyone know that this is where we are, that likely the administrative ordinance will come back to the committee probably at our next meeting to at least discuss the language cleanup issue, and so that we can at least move that process forward rather than staying on hold with that, with the term stagger. Are there any questions?
Well, I think it makes sense to have a bottom-up approach. I think if we could give them some options, which we've discussed, of how to resolve their stagger problem, that might be helpful. And if we could agree with them on when they might address it, you know, just in terms of follow through.
Okay.
I think that's better though than us trying to create one size fits all solutions for it.
Thank you, Councilor Tabor. And it's reasonable for us then, when we're looking at these finally committee language cleanup, to provide some advisory language potentially for the mayor in handling this in the future, but not mandating, I guess, is I think where we currently are. And we will wait and see what else we hear. So if there's nothing else on that topic, I want to move on to the major subject of the day, which is new business. Today we are starting our discussion of conflict of interest. And conflict of interest is very complicated for the city because it is in all of our governing documents in some way or another, from our administrative ordinances to our rules, the city charter, and it's also in our state law that governs our practice. So I think it's important that we kind of look at these documents and take a broader view. And so I have taken the documents that impact us and created a kind of a chart of all the different documents. And so those start with our administrative ordinances, 1801, 1901, 1902, Council Rule 21, the City Charter, Sections 3.8, 3.14, and Amendment C. And I believe there's another amendment as well, Amendment E, that I did not list on here on the agenda. And then we have RSAs as well that impact us directly, which we clearly have no control over. So I think I'm going to share here the key documents list for conflict of interest. This is for the record for those at home so that they know what we are referring to, what we are reviewing. The charter provisions are a little bit more complicated, so we are looking first here at ordinances. The Code of Ethics, Section 1802, which specifically is conflict of interest. We did not look at this when we discussed ethics as a committee. We decided we would come back to conflicts of interest. And then we also have conflict of interest mandatory financial disclosure requirements. That's 1901. This is mostly definitions. But then you get to 1902. You have election candidate financial disclosures. And then you have the recommended financial disclosure form that's in RSA 15A. The city has its own form through the city clerk's office. I think that's important to recognize. And when we get to this particular discussion, we will invite the city clerk to come. Then there's the city charter, and these are the relevant clauses around conflict of interest, what qualifications are required, politics, what, joint service, you can't serve on one and be an employee, pecuniary interest, code of ethics references, holding other offices, non-interference by the council in city manager activity. There's the fire commission's eligibility, removal, incompatible offices. There's a whole conflict of interest section, Amendment C. And then there's also Amendment E, which is for the police department, again, eligibility, removal, incompatible offices. So those are all the sections of the city charter that have anything to do with conflict of interest. Even if they're not directly related to it, they enlighten us on particular conflicts. Then we have Council Rule 21, conflict of interest. And then under state law, these are much more, I think, confusing when you go through them. The powers of conflict of interest ordinance, non-interference by an elected body, the transition provisions section provides some guidance on conflict of interest. There's also general provisions on disqualification of members. And that's for land use boards, so I should note, that's for land use boards. There's a guidance on code of ethics, but this is for the executive branch, so note that this is more guidance for the state thinking around code of ethics. Conflict of interest there, ethics committee establishment, jurisdiction, and membership. And so this governs what the executive branch does, but it provides some guidance for us to know what the state is thinking. So, so those are all the key documents. I thought I would run through them with everyone. And we've invited legal counsel Bob Sullivan here today to share thoughts on conflict of interest and kind of enlighten us on some of the challenges around this and addressing it.
Sure, as both of you know already, and everybody ought to know, this is a really complicated and difficult area in which to work. Both state law, I think, and the citizens at large require or desire that the city have a conflict of interest ordinance. And we have one, we've had it for a long time. And there have been occasionally flare-ups of great complexity and difficulty caused by it. One of the things is this. Portsmouth is a city, but it's not New York City, and everybody can know everybody in a city of this size, which means that a tremendous number of actions that a person takes in their capacity as a city official, whether elected or employed or appointed, can involve people they know, involve businesses they participate in. If some really harsh line were to be drawn on ethics, requiring that nobody do anything if it involves anybody or anything that they know anything about, frankly, government in the city would grind to a halt, necessarily. So that means that really difficult decisions have to be made at every step along the way of, gee, what should be allowed and what should not be allowed. And keep in mind that we have people serving appointed positions of great authority. We have people who serve in relatively nominal positions where they really don't have authority, and it seems that, you know, what the standards that should apply to these people should vary in accordance with how much harm a conflict could actually cause to the city. So this is what Councilor Cook and I have discussed, and is that a logical approach for the committee, this committee, to take would be to march section by section right through the existing conflict of interest ordinance, so that the committee members are confident in understanding what it does and doesn't do, and then having this in your heads, the committee would then consider what to keep, what to change, and what new perhaps to add from what currently exists. And then after all that's done, the idea would be that the committee would make a recommendation to the city council, because, as I said, the conflict of interest provisions are in our code of ethics ordinance. And therefore, ultimately, it's the council which will make the decision based upon your recommendations. So the bottom line is, big job. I think it's going to take some time. I would also anticipate some lively debate about the content of the conflict of interest and code of ethics ordinances. That certainly has historically been true, and some of that history will probably come back during that debate. So I think that, as you know, I'm retired, but I think that the plan is that Suzanne is going to want me to stay with you and do this, and I'm certainly happy to do it.
Thank you so much for being here and providing us advice, because your knowledge of the history of this issue is invaluable to this committee in addressing it. So-
Right, I still have scars I could show you.
We do appreciate you being here to help us. We really do. Are there any questions about?
Yeah, if I could, question for Bob. It looks to me like, would I be correct in assuming that there's a fair amount of state statute about conflict of interest, naming pecuniary interest primarily?
I think that is a correct assumption, and particularly with regard to the land use boards, I think that probably state law sets a standard as high as you would want to go.
Right. They set a juror standard, which is if this land use board member were to sit on this case as a juror, would he be potentially or she be potentially disqualified because of pre-existing bias, because of financial interests? It's a very high standard. But since we're not a home rule state, there's only so far we can go beyond state statute. And
Well, of course, it's correct that we're not a home rule state, meaning that the city only has authority to adopt those laws which are specifically authorized by the legislature that the city may adopt. However, there is specific state legislation.
There's
authorizing
enabling
the city
legislation
to
for-
adopt a code of ethics. So that
Yeah.
probably not going to be the problem, unless the council were to seek to go beyond to create sort of a conflict of interest law. Let me give you a good example. Every collective bargaining agreement that we have in the city is required to have a grievance procedure in it to resolve problems, and every collective bargaining agreement has in it a provision which will describe how an employee could be disciplined or terminated, for example. Now, disciplining or terminating an employee would often involve the same type of conduct or action which would implicate a code of ethics or a conflict of interest. But in a case where you have a discipline procedure defined by a collective bargaining agreement, that limits your authority or limits the council's authority to adopt a conflict of interest provision. You cannot, by means of a code of ethics ordinance, create a more compelling or a more difficult or a more punishing disciplinary procedure than is authorized by collective bargaining agreement for that any particular employee that you might be talking about. And of course, not everybody is in a union, so that would not be a principle applicable to everyone. Would not apply to action against a city councilor, for example.
Right.
But it would apply to an action against a public works employee.
Right. And I think it's good that we go through section by section what we have now. I think one question that I have in my mind as we go through that is there's very little, there seems to be a bright shining line about having a financial interest. So if a governing body has a member who has a financial interest in something that's being discussed, that always in either the state statute, in our local ordinance, in other cities' ordinance, that always is defined as a conflict of interest. Because, I like the language, and it's in one of our, we have conflict in so many different places. We have this language, I can't remember whether it's the ordinances or the council rule or the charter or the amendment, but it says, somebody on a public official should have no more interest than any other citizen or taxpayer. And if he has an interest greater than any other citizen or taxpayer, that's when he or she should say, I've got a conflict.
This is going to become exceedingly nuanced. That can't be avoided
Right.
as you go do your work. Consider this, for example. If you recommend an ordinance that contains a disciplinary code with punishments for city employees, some person whom the city has hired and pays to comply with our rules, that is a radically different situation than if you adopt a code which has standards and punishment for an elected official, let's say a city councilor. City councilors are not hired by the city, are not really paid by the city, and are not as subject to the city's right to discipline them as a public works employee is. So, you know, there's the kind of thing that you will find yourself having to deal with as you go through this code of ethics. Before I forget, let me say this about the code of ethics. It's old. It has generally not been amended or dealt with in well, at least 40 years that I personally know of, and possibly before that. So some of it is anachronistic and dated, and I'm sure you will find provisions in the code of ethics that you want to change, but it's not going to be an easy job to do it.
And it looks like we at one point had a city referendum to have a conflict of interest ordinance. I think the
Yeah, as I
Amendment
remember,
C
Great
is,
Bowls,
was voted on election day by the voters, that this is what they wanted to have. And then there's subsequently, there's the ordinances that we have drafted. So, I mean, it was very much the intent of the voters to have some kind of conflict of interest ordinance. And then it was codified. But as you say, that was a long time ago.
And that was not so much the code of ethics part of it. It dealt with disclosures and financial disclosures, et cetera, as I recall.
But the first one adopted by referendum 1987. So it's 40 years old now.
So you are taking a big bite out of the pie here.
I should add, one of the challenges that I see is, you know, really where are the limitations of even financial disclosure? And the reason that I highlight this is that in my past work experience in the State Department, when you assumed a senior role, you had to divest of all foreign investment. So even your 401k, you had to move all of your investments that were outside of the United States. You had to sell them and reposition all your funds in the U.S. because it was considered a conflict of interest. You know, how far do you go even with financial disclosure? Even of elected officials, do you ask them to go through their entire 401k or 403b and look at every company and see if there's any financial interests in the city of Portsmouth, when people haven't even, most people don't really know where all those investments sit because they're managed by an outside company. So there is a question on financial disclosure, I think, of how far do you go? You know, is it direct financial, your actual direct financial interest, or is it, I held my bank account at this bank, and this bank funds several development projects downtown, so therefore I'm in trouble financially. So there are lines even with, is what I would say, with financial disclosure and being careful with.
Sure, on the surface of it, it would seem appealing, I think, to average citizen that, gee, anybody involved with the city should disclose every element of interest they have in any business that has any involvement in city government. But that would mean a city council, for example, would have to divulge their savings account in a bank that finances a municipal project, which, gee, if you have standards that high, you will find it exceedingly difficult to find people willing to participate in the government because you're so intrusive for no real reason into their personal lives and businesses. So, as it says, it's not going to be easy work.
Are there any other pitfalls, I guess is my question, that we should be watching out for?
Well, I think there's conflict and there's the appearance of conflict.
That is absolutely true.
And, certainly if I'm on the zoning board and I own an adjacent parcel of land and there's going to be development that enhances my property value, I'm directly conflicted.
Actual conflict, I think, even under state law, yeah.
Right. But what about an apparent conflict of interest where there's no pecuniary interest? Well, for example, I sit on the board of Prescott Park Arts Festival. I have a fiduciary duty to do things as board chairman that benefit that nonprofit. And that often, I find, conflicts with my role as a city councilor, like approving their lease fee for the park. So I just recuse. But it's not legally a conflict. There's no pecuniary interest.
Parent conflict's a brutal topic to deal with, and here's why. In order to maintain the confidence of the citizens and the integrity of their government, you can't have things that appear to be a serious conflict of interest go forward without being dealt with. The people, they don't want to think that their government is operating with anything that looks bad, looks like an appearance of conflict. However, there might be no real conflict. Let's say Suzanne and I are very close. She has a real estate development project, and I'm in the city legal department writing all kinds of opinions about real estate projects. Should I be allowed in any way to be involved in her real estate development at all? Should anybody in the legal department be writing things about her real estate development? So it's, these things are invisible lines that you have to draw somehow. I don't know. So you have to deal with conflicts.
Right.
You have to deal with apparent conflicts, but it is going to be really hard to find a way to do it without being, without creating such a burden on otherwise innocent, honest people.
Right.
That the quality of government actually goes down because of the quality of people you can get to participate.
Yeah, and that to me is a really hard question of, is the apparent conflict so glaring in the public's mind that they're saying, this person can't be objective? And I was noticing Concord's conflict of interest policy talks about financial interest as a clear conflict,
Yeah,
but
it's-
then says, an apparent conflict of interest is one that does not affect a person's financial interests, but does call into question his or her objectivity and independence. It names it, but there's no
Yeah.
cure for
And
it.
of course, apparent to whom?
Right.
You know, that you need, if you're going to have subjective things which become the objective measurement, then you have to specify who makes that decision.
Right. And in some cases, like New Hampshire Municipal Association says, well, the elected official or land use appointee can bring it up in public session before the topic's discussed and say, you know, I have what would appear to be a conflict, and an average citizen can say, I'm not objective. So I want to raise this now, and can even ask for a vote,
Yep, and get advisory vote.
an advisory vote. But at least then it's all out on the table.
That also raises another issue, though, as well. Whose job is it to enforce conflict of interest disclosure? So, you know, the question of like an advisory vote, is it the job of the council as a whole to enforce it, or is it the job of individual members of the council to be compliant and to disclose? The reason I ask this is that if you were looking not just at the council, but if you're looking at individuals serving on, say, the zoning board, do other members of the zoning board have the authority to enforce disclosure on another member of the zoning board, rather than that member just having to disclose it? Because we have a whole process for that. If somebody doesn't disclose it and it's deemed that there's a complaint filed, that there's a conflict of interest, we have an ethics process for that. But there really isn't an enforcement mechanism that triggers before you hit the complaint ethics process. It is left to individual elected officials or appointed officials to disclose. And then I have the question of, are their fellow members on that board or the council even qualified to make the call on the part of that individual?
You, to a very large degree, will get to control this by what you do. I have kind of a recommendation which goes along those lines, which is, it is sad, or I've read somewhere that the great evil of conflicts of interest is that the true motivation of a person in the government in taking the action is not apparent to all that's known. Go back to my earlier example. I'm writing legal opinions in the city legal department. Suzanne is my friend. She has a real estate development going, so I write some opinion that's going to allow her to make more money. That entirely secret, nobody would know that had ever happened. And that's the evil of the conflicts of interest. Now, for that reason, it was either Louis Brandeis or Felix Frankfurter, one of those Supreme Court judges, who wrote that sunshine is the greatest disinfectant. So if I announce, gee, Suzanne's a close friend of mine, and I'm writing this opinion, it has some effect on our real estate development project. Now, at least, there is no secret agenda or secret motivation that isn't apparent to everyone. And people listening to what I say after that will be able to weigh my statements with that in mind. So they say, well, you know, he may be a friend of Suzanne's, but what he's saying makes perfect sense. Mm-hmm. So, you know, we'll listen to it, or something else. Mm-hmm. So what this leads to is my recommendation to you, that in doing your work, you consider that disclosure of interest is a cure to a great many conflicts of interest for the reason that I said. So you might think about just, requiring disclosure so that people can decide for themselves. If it's a city councilor who has to disclose, then the people decide at the next election whether they want to take some action or not because of it. And that kind of thing. So maybe by considering that disclosure solves a lot of problems, you can make things a little simpler and a little more clean by compelling disclosures and then letting nature take its course afterwards.
I think there's another reason to disclose. In the example of, Counselor Cook was asking, should the body itself discuss the conflict? Well, if they don't discuss it, and then somebody tries to void the action of that board or that council, you will wish you had disclosed it and discussed it.
Yeah, and that in fact is the law in the zoning and planning context. A person who believes that a board member is disqualified by reason of a conflict is required to state that as early as it's known, rather than hold it as an ace card until a decision comes out, and if they don't like it, then they bring up the conflict and attempt to overturn the board.
In which case,
Required to bring it forward.
all the board's deliberation has been wasted time, because you might have to do it all over again.
That is why we advise the planning board and the zoning board to announce early on, and the planning board at least used to do this very regularly at every meeting. Anyone who feels that any member of this board has a conflict in connection with their case should raise that issue now. And the reason that statement gets made by the planning board is it prevents a person who feels there's a conflict from bringing it up later on after all the deliberations have been completed.
Right.
There's a very clear law on that.
Yeah. But I think that's a theme as we go through these, that one way to deal with apparent conflict or even real financial conflict is to bring it up in open session and discuss it.
Sure. So if I'm on the planning board and there's a site review application in front of me for a bank and I work for a different bank, I announce early on at the meeting, I work for a different bank than the applicant bank. I don't feel I have any conflict. I don't have any direct pecuniary interest. And that, frankly, it's not of consequence to me whether the other bank does well or not, so I intend to vote. And then a person can raise it then if they feel that's a problem. And if they don't raise it then, it's waived.
Right. And oftentimes there have been some cases, court cases, where zoning decisions like that have been challenged, and the court has said, the board covered this. And those of you who didn't speak up at the time, you waived your right to come back later and address it in court.
Yep, exactly my point.
This also, though, raises the concern that you may have, if you ask at the beginning of meetings, this becomes the habit of asking if anyone has a conflict of interest, like legal counsel Sullivan said earlier, because Portsmouth is a small enough city, people know one another, they go places. At the council level, that may open you to regular accusations of conflict when it's more a concern around appearance of conflict and there actually isn't conflict. For example, if someone owned a business in town and the council was dealing with a new ordinance that might impact any business, And so was it, well, everyone who owns a business then should be, automatically excluded from the discussion. But that would limit the ability of the council to take action on any proposal. And it probably isn't a direct conflict.
Having mentioned the council, I think it's also going to be absolutely necessary for you, as you do your work, to consider the difference between those public officials who act in a quasi-judicial capacity, such as a zoning board or planning board, who are supposed to be neutral when they enter their deliberations, and counselors who serve in a legislative capacity, not a judicial capacity. And not only are counselors not expected to be neutral, they are in fact elected to their positions because of the viewpoints which they bring into those positions. And so the standard, the conflict of interest standard, is much more relaxed for legislative bodies than for judicial, for the reason that I said.
Right.
If everybody on the city council got elected because they were neutral on every single issue, then there would be no difference whatsoever between the people running for council. And you might as well pick them out of a hat.
Yeah, I mean, if somebody says, you're predisposed, you're biased to vote for more affordable housing when you have the opportunity.
So
Well,
that's a great
we ran on it.
Yeah.
And to some extent, that we put that before the voters.
You get elected because of your biases, which you stand up at candidates' nights and announce, which you write down on paper and mail to everybody in the city, which
That's right.
your bias is what gets you into your position. So,
And that would be the same for all the volunteer boards, volunteer committees as well. For committee service, people who we appoint to committees because they have a direct interest in that subject matter. I'm thinking of committees like Arts and Nonprofits or the Economic Development Commission, or, we usually appoint people who are in that field working in the city. So,
that is certainly true. Look at the people who want to be on the Historic District Commission, for example, are people who have an interest in historic matters. They're anything but the average uninformed citizen.
I need to step out at 11 because I have another commitment. I just wanted to offer up, one of the things that kind of jumped out at me as I was reviewing once more the existing ordinances and then the charter is that it might be helpful if you're going to dive into this area to really look at definitions and kind of pick things apart rather than trying to group things all together. For example, as Bob already pointed out, is obvious to everyone, employees are in a very different category, and while there's certainly a lot of overlap and conflict of interest with elected officials, it might be helpful to kind of call them out a little more clearly than is in our current ordinance, because as you read along, there's a reference to employees, and then it skips, and then it's just elected officials or appointed boards, and it's just a little hard, to untangle easily. So structure, definitions, I noticed, I think somewhere I read there's the word family, whereas, and I thought, well, what does that mean? Versus I noticed it was one of the state ordinances, I think, where they define it's a spouse or dependents. And so there's a real clear boundary to that, which I thought was useful. I think it was with the financial disclosure. So that was just my kind of quick, really chunk it out and look at either definitions or structure to make things a little clearer, and I think that will help the conversation move forward, because there is so much here. And I definitely agree with Bob. I think, there's nothing like putting all the cards on the table to understand that, and it is important to distinguish between the legislative role and the different role that, for example, the quasi-judicial boards have to take. So, good that you covered that ground, because I think that's very important.
Yeah, I think it raises the question to me of how comprehensive do we want to try to be? When I look at our ordinance, it covers employees and officials. It covers quasi-judicial, and it covers legislative. And when I look at other cities in the state, they all pretty much do the same. And they all have about a page and a half or 2 pages focused on pecuniary interest. So, how comprehensive do we want to go? Do we want to try to do something for each of those different classes? Employee, quasi-judicial, elected. There's plenty of case law about each, setting standards. And how broken do we think the ordinance that we have now is? It's old, but is it broken?
Yeah, I would highlight in the current ordinance, we are doing better than some of our neighboring towns. I mean, currently, we have a neighboring town that has a particular challenge around having a mayor who's also the, in effect, assistant superintendent of schools. So, and so there are constant questions around conflict, and we forbid elected officials from serving in employee roles with the city.
They have to relinquish their job the day of the canvass of the vote.
Exactly. So we already, I have to say, are ahead of some of our neighboring communities in the state. So there is a lot of merit in the current conflict of interest provisions.
Well, I could suggest a goal for you. It's this. The average citizen comes home, it used to be they'd read the newspaper, now they come home and scan the internet. But they see all kinds of bad things happening in all kinds of other municipalities all over the country and the world. And it causes them to think in the back of their minds a little bit, gee, maybe some of that kind of stuff is going on here. Well, I personally don't believe any of that kind of stuff is going on here. And but the point I'm trying to make is that it is really necessary that the citizens of the community have confidence in the honesty, integrity, and ethics of the government. It is like one of the most important things that can happen. So the goal which I'm suggesting for you in writing or recommending your code of ethics change is that be the talisman. Will everything that you write or everything you recommend help make the public more confident about the integrity of the government, or be harmful, or is it necessary for that purpose? Is it not necessary for that purpose? And so I think that's a standard you can use to measure things as you go about your work, and it's a good standard. And if it succeeds, then you've done what really needs to be done.
Yeah, and back when we worked on the ethics board and modernizing that language, we had that great article from New York State that said, ethics and morality can be different. Somebody can have a small financial interest in something before the city council or boards, and they may act morally, but you want a strong ethics ordinance that says we don't want somebody tempted in that situation. We want to prevent any occurrence of that where somebody has a direct interest in what's being discussed. So the ethics guideline, you know, takes even a moral person and says, we're not going to even tempt you. We're going to remove this temptation. We're going to remove the situation where you have an interest greater than any other citizen. You can't do that. And I think that's where it gets to what you're saying. The citizen can have confidence that we have that bulwark in place that prevents somebody from even having the temptation. You know, like Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, has to be above reproach.
I've used that example in the past.
Yeah.
But I think that's, you know, it's another way of saying the same goal. Is there a bulwark in place so that the citizen feels like a good person or a bad person would be treated equally and fenced out of any situation where they have a financial interest or direct interest in what's being discussed?
Probably the two moments in any given year in which the average citizen thinks the most about the city government are the two times when they write the checks to pay their taxes. You want them at least to think, as they write that check, gee, this is a lot of money, but I know the people who are representing me in City Hall are honest, hardworking people trying to do a good job.
Yeah.
Sign their name.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And, you know, personally, I think what we have now is more comprehensive than other towns and cities, goes beyond state statute, and is pretty good. You know, albeit old. You know, so, I mean, where can it be improved?
And I think that that's where we, as a committee, that's our jumping off point. Where can we improve what we already have? I know there's some areas that I definitely want to look at around election disclosure. I think is pretty minimal. So I think we probably have to look at that, and the annual disclosure forms that are filed are also pretty minimal. So we should probably look at that as well and see if people are, if the questions asked for disclosure are all encompassing of the intent of the charter language, I guess. And that's really the question. Does it fit the charter language? Because changing the charter is a whole different process. So we need to make sure we feel like we're fully in compliance with the charter language.
Of course, that's why I'm here, to help you with that kind of stuff. And, you know, I've been around a long time and I've seen a lot of disputes, and I certainly will stay with you till the end, as long as I can.
You're
Do you
very brave.
recall the origin of the ordinances that we now have, 801 and 901 and 902?
Most of them were in place before I came to work for the city.
Really? Wow, they
They're
really
They're
are.
really pretty old. And that's why they could stand a review. Technology's changed, society's changed.
Yes. Yeah, that's what I'm always thinking of. Society has changed significantly. The way we function as a society has changed, and interests are maybe very different now.
Certainly true.
Yeah. So, are there any other questions or things that we want to address right now? Before we will get into this discussion in detail at our next meeting. We will start with, if it's okay with everyone, I thought we would start with the charter language, so that we're very familiar with the charter language, which we won't be changing, and then dive in to the first ordinance, 1801, which is the conflict of interest section in the ethics ordinance. I think it's very important that we just have a very good understanding of the charter language because it directly impacts the other, even if there is no recommendation to change the charter language. And there might be, I don't want to prejudge that. If we come forward with a recommendation to change the charter language, that's probably a long process, just so everyone knows at home. We're probably a little late to start that process to get it on the ballot this year, and it would require a special election or waiting 2 years for that change to occur.
Yeah, my recollection from other charter amendment endeavors has been that if the city council is able to make its decision on charter amendments by, say, August, then there's still time to get charter amendment questions on the ballot in November. But for the council to get to these, it means you have to go through your whole process and make your recommendations. Enough time to give the full council a chance to think about this and make a decision by August. So it's, it goes fast.
So as we're discussing it, we should keep that in mind, but review the charter section first, and then come to our ordinances section.
Right.
And we can always go back to the charter if we find in working on the ordinances that there's something that comes up that we feel like absolutely should be addressed that wasn't addressed in the charter language. Then we can always come back to it. But I just want everyone to know that there is kind of, that one has a clear deadline, timeline on it.
Right.
And then we'll proceed through the other ordinances as well. So does that make sense to you, Councilor Tabor, to approach it that way?
Oh, absolutely, because I think that the Charter Amendment C instructs the city on behalf of what people voted for to establish a conflict of interest ordinance, including all the boards and commissions and what it contains.
So that's where we'll start at our next meeting. If there are no other questions, with that, I want to open public comment. Is there anyone who would like to speak? If you're on Zoom, raise your hand if you want to speak. Come on up.
Peter Huda, 280 South Street. So I want to bring my background to you. I'm going to put my accounting hat on. And throughout your training as an accountant, you have to take numerous ethics. And even in the CPA, one of the sections of the CPA exam is about ethics. So I think in listening to the discussion here, the one thing that has not been discussed, and for me, it's been an easy thing to analyze and say, oh, this is a conflict, is the ability to influence an outcome for either for yourself or for whoever you work for or for the city. I think that part applies to your boards where someone should recuse themselves if they have the ability to influence an outcome for either it be for themselves that they have, they own property, or for close friends, like the example that that Bob and Suzanne gave. So that's part of the question that I ask myself, and I think it would help everybody if you ask yourself, well, do I have the ability to influence something here that would benefit me, as in Prescott Park? It would benefit me in whatever other position I'm in, and then the other side of it is it would benefit me financially. So in accounting, it's just a big no-no. I mean, I have worked for companies where we went out and selected banks, and the bank wanted to give you a T-shirt, and I had supervisors that wouldn't even take that. You have to be really careful there. The other thing, on the financial side, I think you need to understand the difference, and this is coming from an accounting perspective of, are you going, when you take something, whether it be a gift or a meal or anything, that could be assigned a financial amount, at what point do you consider, would that be considered a bribe? There's two things there from an accounting perspective. It's, you need to be very careful that you don't cross that line. And then the other side of that is, and this is a personal thing, but if you keep going on that, at what point in time do you need to report that on your taxes? Because that is income. So that's pulling back from accounting stuff, but I think the big thing here that wasn't discussed was the ability to influence an outcome, whether it be financial or to benefit your company or your friend or your organization, and I think that's a big consideration. And hopefully you'll look into that, and maybe that's an easy way for anybody to look at that. The other discussion about going deep into people's financial records, or whatever you want to say, this would, to me, in my mind, this would apply to that. What would be the benefit to doing that? I mean, would it change the outcome? No. But if somebody did, like was said, if somebody did have a interest in a bank or developer or whatever it may be, or a close relationship where they could influence the outcome of a decision that was going to be made later, you might personally consider that. I know that most of the people that do run for council don't have that background, and I think that might be a easy way to look at that. I hope that helps. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that wants to speak? Okay. If there's no one else, then I'm going to go ahead and close public comment. The last thing on our agenda today is announcements. I'm announcing what we are covering for the next few weeks. The next meeting is April the 10th, and we will talk about conflict of interest. We also will have a discussion on some committees that might want to convert from being blue ribbon committees to being standing committees. I know there's some committees that are currently having discussions around that. And we will revisit the administrative ordinance question on committee language cleanup. I will also provide that parks update. Hopefully I'll have that update by April the 10th to provide to the committee. Then on April 24th, we will continue a few of those discussions. At least that's anticipated, that this is going to take some time to address. I should also note that I will be inviting guests to come in and speak to the committee as needed to provide us additional advice on conflict of interest and how it's addressed elsewhere. So with that said, are there any other announcements, or no? All right, then can I get a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
I will second that, I guess. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. We are.